Hello, everyone. Today we are going to talk about the assessment of risk for sexual violence. So, first, we need to start off by talking about Megan's Law. Megan's Law refers to federal and state laws in the United States that mandate public access to information about registered sex offenders. These laws are named after Megan Conca, a 7-year-old from New Jersey who was raped and murdered by a neighbor who was a convicted sex offender in 1994. The public outrage over Megan's death led to the rapid development of legislation designed to protect communities by providing access to information about individuals who have committed sex crimes. So, you know about Megan Conca and the tragic case. This really highlighted the lack of awareness in the community regarding the criminal background of offenders who may be living nearby. Megan's parents argued that if they had known about the offender's criminal history, they would have been more vigilant and possibly prevented the crime. So, this led to the introduction of the legislation that required sex offenders to register their whereabouts and for certain information about them to be made publicly available. The sex offender registration and notification laws in the United States began in the 1990s and have undergone significant changes over time. And there are some gaps, there are some controversies, so we're going to talk about each of these. First, we're going to talk about the Jacob Wetterling Crimes Against Children and Sexually Violent Offender Registration Act. This was the first federal law requiring states to establish sex offender registries. It mandated that individuals convicted of sexual offenses involving minors must register with law enforcement after release from incarceration or parole. Following Megan's murder, Congress passed Megan's Law, which was an amendment to Jacob Wetterling Act. So this law introduced the requirement for public notification, ensuring that communities would be informed of the presence of sex offenders. And then we move on to the Pam Lyncher Sex Offender Tracking and Identification Act of 1996. This act created a national database for sex offenders. It's managed by the FBI, and it was designed to track offenders as they move from one state to another, and it aimed to fill gaps in state level registration by ensuring consistency across jurisdictions. Then if we move on to the Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act, this was came about in 2006. The Adam Walsh Act significantly strengthened registration and notification systems, creating the SORNA, which stands for Sex Offender Registration and Notification Act. SORNA was designed to standardize the registration process across the United States, increasing penalties for noncompliance and providing a more uniform rules and regulations regarding the classification of offenders. It also expanded the scope of offenders' requirement to register and imposed stricter guidelines on how frequently offenders must update their information. So, some key aspects of the Adam Walsh Act include creating the National Sex Offender Registry under the Department of Justice. There's also a standardized 3-tiered system for classifying offenders based on the severity of the crime, and the requirements that offenders must update their information regularly and sometimes even as frequently as every 3 months for very high risk offenders. So, the sex offender registry and community notification laws are legal frameworks established by the United States to manage, track, and inform the public about individuals convicted of sex offenses. And these laws aim to reduce the likelihood of reoffending and to enhance public safety by making information about sex offenders available to law enforcement and, in many cases, the general public. Individuals convicted of certain sex crimes are required to register with law enforcement agencies. The purpose of this registration is to ensure that law enforcement knows where offenders live, work, or attend school. So let's talk about who needs to register. Individuals convicted of sex crimes such as rape, sexual assault, child molestation, possession of child pornography, and other offenses may be required to register. The exact list of offenses that requires registration does vary state by state, but it typically includes both violent and nonviolent sexual offenses. Let's talk about the information that is required. So, offenders must provide their name and any aliases, their current address, their place of employment and or school, their vehicle information. There must be an updated photograph. In some jurisdictions, fingerprints and DNA samples are also kept on file, and the information for which the crime they were convicted. So, the duration of the time that an individual is required to register depends on the severity of the offense and whether the offender is considered to be low, moderate, or high risk for reoffense. In some cases, registration is for a set number of years, say, for example, 10 years, or all the way up to life, depending upon the tier in which the offender is placed. So, one of the most significant features of Megan's Law is the public notification aspect. Information about sex offenders is made available to the public, typically through online registries maintained by law enforcement agencies. And the goal is to provide community members with the knowledge needed to take preventative measures to protect themselves and their families. So, a couple different ways that the community may be notified is first and foremost online registries. Many states provide an online sex offender registry that the public can access by entering the name, address, or location to view a list of sex offenders living in the area. This type of information can be accessed by the public, including the offender's name, photograph, address, crime committed, and maybe some other personal details. And the level of detail is going to vary depending upon the offender's risk level and, again, the laws and information regarding that state. There's also another method of notification called direct notification, and this is where law enforcement may send out flyers, mailers, or alerts to local residents, schools, and businesses when a high risk offender moves into the neighborhood. And then a third method of notification is proactive disclosure to institutions. So perhaps schools, daycare centers, religious institutions, any type of organization working with children or vulnerable populations may receive direct notification from law enforcement about sex offenders in their vicinity, particularly if the offender is considered a threat to public safety. So let's talk about the level of risk. As I mentioned, typically there are three tiers. The first tier is low risk, and this typically includes offenders convicted of less serious crimes, such as indecent exposure. These offenders may still be required to register, but face less public disclosure. Tier 2, this is moderate risk. This includes offenders with more serious offenses. Information may be publicly available, and moderate notifications efforts may be undertaken by the authorities. And then Tier 3, this is high risk. And this includes offenders who are considered most likely to reoffend, such as repeat offenders or those convicted of particularly violent or heinous crimes. Community notification and full disclosure of their information are often mandatory. So let's talk a little bit about rights and privacy issues regarding all these laws around sexual offenders and notification. So, Megan's Law has faced a lot of criticism regarding privacy and civil rights, particularly concerning the long term consequences for registered offenders. Critics argue that the public availability of offenders' information can lead to vigilantism, harassment, and challenges in reintegration into society. Additionally, there have been debates about whether offenders convicted of less serious crimes or those who have been rehabilitated should face the same level of public exposure. So, let's talk a little bit about the impact on offenders. Registered sex offenders may face significant difficulties in securing employment, housing, or rebuilding their lives due to the stigma attached to being listed on the public registry. Some have reported threats or violence due to the inclusion of their name and information on these databases. A major criticism of community notification laws is that they can lead to unintended consequences such as harassment, threats, and physical violence against offenders. The widespread dissemination of personal information can make it difficult for offenders to find, again, like we talked about, employment and housing, and just reintegrating into society. This stigma associated with being on the registry can also lead to social isolation as well as emotional distress. Many offenders have brought legal challenges arguing that Megan's Law constitutes additional punishment after their sentence has been served, violating constitutional protections against ex post facto. So basically, that means imposing penalties retroactively. However, the courts have generally upheld the laws, ruling that its intent is to protect public safety rather than to continue to punish offenders. So, some controversies around this. Some critics argue that Megan's Law may give communities a false sense of security, as the majority of sex offenses are committed by someone known to the victim, such as a family member or an acquaintance, rather than a stranger. And there are also concerns that the registry casts too wide of a net, including offenders who may not pose a significant risk to the community, such as individuals convicted of statutory rape in cases of a consensual teenage relationship. So, the primary goal of registration and community notification laws is to prevent recidivism by allowing the public and law enforcement to monitor sex offenders. However, the research on the effectiveness of these laws is very mixed. Some studies suggest that registries may have a limited impact on reducing reoffense rates. Many sex crimes are committed by individuals who are not registered sex offenders, and most offenses occur within familiar contexts, making the registry less relevant to these situations. On the other hand, community notification laws can sometimes prompt increased vigilance among potential victims and alert law enforcement to suspicious behavior. However, their role in directly reducing recidivism is very much still debated. So let's talk about the cost of implementing these registries. Maintaining sex offender registries and conducting community notification can be very resource intensive for law enforcement agencies, and the cost includes monitoring the offenders, updating the registries, and conducting risk assessments. So, let's briefly talk about some international comparisons. While the United States has some of the most extensive sex offender registration and community notification laws, other countries also implement similar systems, though they often differ in scope and approach. The United Kingdom, they have the Sex Offender Act of 1997. This created a sex offender registry, but public access to the information is much more limited. Only law enforcement and certain professionals, such as child protection officers, can access detailed information about offenders. In Canada, we have the Sex Offender Information Registration Act, and it involves a national registry, but again, it is primarily for law enforcement use only, and community notification is much less common compared to the United States. Sex offender registration and community notification laws are a key aspect of the United States criminal justice system and how they approach managing sex offenders. While these laws aim to protect public safety by informing communities and reducing the risk of reoffending, they also raise very important questions about privacy, effectiveness, and fairness. Over time, these laws have expanded and become more standardized across states with increasing federal oversight. However, debates continue over their social and legal implications, potential for stigmatization, and the appropriate balance between public safety and offenders' rights. So let's move over and talk a little bit about SVPs, or sexually violent predators. SVPs are a distinct classification of sex offenders who are considered to pose a particularly high risk of committing future sexual offenses due to their diagnosed mental disorder or personality disorder that predisposes them to commit acts of sexual violence. This legal designation exists under both state and federal laws and allows for the civil commitment of these individuals after they have completed their criminal sentences under the rationale that they continue to pose a threat to public safety. So, the concept of SVP has sparked significant legal, ethical, and psychological debate due to its blending of criminal justice and the mental health systems. So, we are going to talk in depth here today about SVPs. So, let's give a definition of who is a sexually violent predator. So, this person has been convicted or charged of a sexually violent offense, such as rape, child molestation, or aggravated sexual assault, and they are diagnosed with a mental abnormality or personality disorder that makes them likely to engage in future acts of sexual violence if not confined and treated. The diagnosis of a quote unquote mental abnormality is a legal term, and it is key to SVP designation as it establishes a clinical basis for continued control of the individual even after their criminal sentence has been served. The mental conditions commonly associated with SVP designations include paraphilic disorders such as pedophilia and exhibitionism. We're going to talk more about this in detail in a future slide. Antisocial personality disorder, and some other conditions that may impair an individual's ability to control deviant sexual urges. So let's talk a little bit about the legal framework. Sexually violent predator laws allow for civil commitment of individuals who are deemed to be dangerous, even after they have served their prison sentence. The legal framework for SVP commitment laws was developed primarily in response to high-profile cases of repeat sexual offenders committing brutal crimes after being released from prison. The first state to enact SVP laws was Washington in 1990, following a series of violent offenses by repeat sex offenders. Over the next decade, many other states followed, establishing similar laws under the banner of sexually violent predator acts. By the early 2000s, around 20 states had civil commitment laws for SVPs, including California, Kansas, Florida, and New Jersey. Still to this day, not every state recognizes sexually violent predators. It is just found in certain states. At the federal level, the Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act of 2006, which we talked about earlier, does allow for civil commitment of SVPs after federal prison sentences. So let's talk about the 3 pieces of information that a forensic psychologist must prove in order to civilly commit someone as a sexually violent predator. So first and foremost, the individual has to have been committed of a sexually violent offense. Second, the individual must suffer from a diagnosed mental abnormality or personality disorder that predisposes them to commit further sexual acts of violence. And then lastly, this individual is deemed likely to engage in future acts of sexual violence if not confined. So the commitment process usually involves a civil trial in which the state must prove these elements by quote unquote clear and convincing evidence. That is a high burden of proof, though lower than the criminal standard of beyond a reasonable doubt. So let's talk a little bit about the constitutionality of these laws. It has been upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court in a very famous case, Kansas v. Hendricks, 1997. The court ruled that civil commitment of SVPs did not violate constitutional protections against double jeopardy, which that just means being punished twice for the same crime, or ex post facto punishment, and that basically means retroactive punishment. So, because the laws are regulatory and not punitive, the goal of SVP laws, the court held, is treatment and protection from the public, not further punishment of the offender. So let's talk a bit about this process. The civil commitment of an SVP generally follows a legal process distinct from criminal sentencing. So an individual nearing the end of their prison sentence, there's a team of experts, very often including forensic psychologists, perhaps a psychiatrist, conducts an in-depth evaluation to determine whether the person meets the criteria for sexually violent predator designation. And this evaluation includes a review of their criminal records, mental health history, assessment scores, lots of collateral information. Then, if the evaluator believes the individual qualifies as an SVP, the state attorney general or equivalent official files a petition for civil commitment. This petition initiates the legal process for keeping the individual confined. A judge reviews the evidence to determine whether there is probable cause to believe that the individual is an SVP. If probable cause is found, the individual is detained pending a civil trial. At the trial, the state must present evidence, including expert testimony, that the individual is a sexually violent predator. The individual has the right to contest this evidence and present their own expert witnesses. If the court rules in favor of the state, the individual is committed to a secure treatment facility. Once committed, SVPs are sent to a secure treatment facility where they undergo treatment designed to address their sexual deviance and reduce their risk of reoffending. However, these facilities are not simply extensions of the prison system, they are legally considered treatment centers. The primary goal of SVP treatment is rehabilitation, with the ultimate aim of reducing the individual's risk to the point where they are no longer needing to be confined. Treatment may include things like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. This is a very common approach that focuses on helping offenders recognize and change harmful thinking patterns and behaviors. There may be relapse prevention, which is going to help the offender develop strategies to avoid high-risk situations that could lead to reoffending. And there could also be pharmacotherapy. In some cases, medications that reduce sex drive may be used to help manage deviant sexual arousal. As you may imagine, there are challenges in treatment. Treating SVPs is notoriously difficult, and many individuals remain confined for very long periods of time, sometimes for the rest of their life, because they are deemed too high risk to be released. High recidivism rates among sexual offenders, combined with the unique psychological challenges they face, make rehabilitation a very complex process. Additionally, the stigma and public fear surrounding these individuals make it difficult for some to successfully reintegrate into society even after treatment. So let's talk about release from civil commitment. SVP laws generally provide for periodic reviews of the individual's status to determine whether they can be safely released. So, for example, in South Carolina, individuals who are SVPs have the opportunity to be reevaluated annually. This may vary from state to state. To be released from civil commitment, the state must be convinced that the individual's risk has been sufficiently reduced and that they can safely live in the community under supervision or monitoring. So, we can talk about two different ways of release. First is conditional release. Some individuals may be released under strict conditions, such as some type of electronic monitoring, maybe regular therapy, or restrictions on where they can live and work. Whereas a full release, which happens in rare cases, individuals may be deemed fully rehabilitated and released without supervision. As you can imagine, there are many controversies and criticisms around SVP laws. We talked about this a moment ago, but double jeopardy. Critics argue that committing someone after they have completed their prison sentence constitutes a form of double punishment, violating the Constitution's protection against double jeopardy. And then again, we mentioned ex post facto punishment. Some argue that applying civil commitment retroactively after the individual's original conviction and sentencing constitutes ex post facto punishment, which is prohibited by the Constitution. As you may remember, we talked about the U.S. Supreme Court case, Kansas v. Hendricks, that upheld the constitutionality of SVP laws, finding that civil commitment is a form of preventative detention and not a punishment, therefore making this constitutional. One of the most controversial aspects of SVP laws is the potential for indefinite confinement. Many individuals committed under these laws spend decades in civil commitment facilities, sometimes never being released, even though they have technically completed their criminal sentences. So critics argue this amount of lifelong punishment without due process. And then let's talk about effectiveness of treatment. There is ongoing debate about the effectiveness of treatment for SVPs. While some studies suggest that cognitive behavioral therapy and other types of interventions can reduce recidivism rates, others argue that the nature of sexual predators makes rehabilitation very unlikely. And this raises ethical concerns about confining individuals who may not be able to be rehabilitated. Let's also talk about public safety versus individual rights. The core tension underlying SVP laws is balancing of public safety with individual rights. While the state has compelling interest in protecting its citizens from dangerous sex offenders, critics of SVP laws argue that the indefinite confinement of individuals who have already served their criminal sentence violates basic principles of justice. So, all around, sexually violent predator laws are very complex intersection of the criminal justice system and the mental health system aimed to protect the public from high-risk offenders. However, they raise very important ethical and legal questions about civil liberties, the nature of mental illness, and the limits of state power. So these laws continue to evolve as the courts, the lawmakers, and mental health professionals grapple with the challenge of balancing public safety with the rights of individuals. So now that you have a very good idea of the background around these laws and understanding sexually violent predators, we're going to move on to talk about risk. So, when we are evaluating sex offenders, a comprehensive understanding of risk factors is essential to determine the likelihood for reoffending. So, if you recall, there's going to be static and dynamic risk factors. Static risk factors are factors that cannot change over time, such as the age at which the person's first offense occurred, the number of prior convictions, and victim characteristics, such as a preference for young children. So, again, static risk factors cannot change. Then we've got dynamic risk factors. These factors can change with intervention. So perhaps that is substance abuse, deviant sexual arousal, and emotion regulation. So let's just break down some of these various different types of risk factors. So, first, let's talk about deviant sexual arousal. This refers to sexual attraction to quote unquote inappropriate or legal stimuli, such as non consenting adults, children, or behaviors like violence and coercion. This is a key risk factor in sexual offending because it underlies the motivation for the crime. We are going to talk in depth about paraphilias, but first we'll just mention pedophilia, which is one of the most prominent examples of deviant sexual arousal, where individuals are sexually attracted to prepubescent children. We also need to talk about sexual coercion and rape, which may be fueled by arousal linked to domination, control, or causing harm. So, deviant sexual arousal is often assessed through a psychophysiological measure called the PPG, which stands for the penile plethysmograph, where arousal patterns are measured in response to various stimuli. Cognitive behavioral treatments often focus on reducing or controlling deviant arousal patterns, but the persistence of these patterns significantly heightens the risk of reoffense. Sexual sadism. This involves deriving sexual pleasure from inflicting pain, humiliation, or suffering upon others. Individuals with sexual sadism are more likely to commit violent sexual offenses because they gain gratification from causing harm. Some key characteristics may be torture or extreme violence during the sexual offense. It could be non consensual behavior, often involving significant physical or psychological harm to the victim, and repetition and escalation, as sexual sadists may increase the severity of their actions over time to continue to maintain arousal. Sexual sadism, as you can imagine, is difficult to treat because it involves ingrained patterns of arousal and behavior that are closely tied to the offender's sexual gratification. And research shows that individuals with this disorder pose a particularly high risk for future violent sexual crimes. Victimization of a child. Offenders who target children are often seen as high risk due to the vulnerability of their victims and the potential for ingrained deviant sexual preferences. Child sexual abusers often have a history of offending against minors, indicating a strong and enduring sexual preference for children. Grooming behaviors, where they manipulate children into trusting them and making it much easier to exploit them. and emotional congruence with children, meaning they feel a stronger emotional or sexual connection to a child compared to an adult. The risk of reoffending increases if the offender has a large number of victims, committed violent acts, or if the abuse was prolonged or repetitive. Victimizing children also tends to have a greater psychological impact, making the offender's behavior particularly dangerous to public safety. Psychopathy, we had an entire lecture on this already, but if you remember, this is one of the strongest predictors of sexual and violent recidivism. Psychopathy is a combination of affective, interpersonal, and behavioral traits. If you remember, some of these traits include lack of empathy or remorse for others, including victims, manipulation and deceitfulness of behavior, especially for personal gain, impulsivity or poor behavioral controls, and shallow or callous emotional responses. Again, if you remember, we talked about the PCLR, the Harris Psychopathy Checklist Revised, and this is one of the ways in which we can assess psychopathy in individuals. Scores are based on specific personality traits and behaviors. Sex offenders with high psychopathy scores are often more predatory, opportunistic, violent, and pose a greater risk of reoffending due to their inability to form genuine emotional connections or concern for others. They are also more resistant to treatment as their lack of insight and motivation to change hinders rehabilitation efforts. Next up here, we have major mental illness. While major mental illness is not typically a direct cause of sexual offending, it can increase the likelihood of offending or reoffending when combined with other risk factors. Some mental illnesses that are commonly associated with sexual offending may include schizophrenia or other psychotic disorders where delusions or hallucinations might involve sexual content or lead to disinhibition. Bipolar disorder, especially during manic episodes, which may result in impulsive or reckless sexual behavior. Major depressive disorder can lead to impaired judgment or disinhibition of behavior in some cases, although this is much less common in sexual offending. However, it's important to note that mental illness alone is not a significant predictor of sexual recidivism unless it is accompanied by other risk factors like psychopathy, deviant arousal, substance use, and a lot of other things we're going to talk about here. So, treatment of underlying mental health conditions is crucial in reducing recidivism of reoffending. Impulsivity. This is a tendency to act without thinking or considering the consequences, often leading to poor decision making. It is a core trait of many sex offenders, particularly those with antisocial personality disorder or having psychopathy. Impulsivity increases the risk of sexual offenses because the offender may act on sudden, intense sexual urges without considering the legality or morality of their actions. They may be unable to control inappropriate sexual behavior in high risk situations, and impulsive offenders are less likely to engage in planning or grooming, making their behavior unpredictable. Impulse control issues are a major focus of cognitive behavioral interventions, aiming to help offenders develop strategies to pause, reflect, and to avoid risky situations or behaviors. Next, we have irrationality. In sexual offending, this refers to cognitive distortions or faulty thinking patterns that justify deviant sexual behavior. Common irrational beliefs include minimization or denial of harm caused to the victim. For example, someone may think the victim wasn't really hurt. Entitlement, in which perhaps an example thought or statement might be, I deserve this sexual gratification. Victim blaming, again, this may include the distorted cognition of the victim was asking for it. Also, sexual objectification, where the offender views others purely as objects for sexual gratification, often dehumanizing the victim in the process. Irrational thinking supports the continuation of offending behavior because it allows the offender to avoid guilt or responsibility. Cognitive behavioral therapy focuses heavily on challenging and correcting these distortions to reduce the risk of future sexual violence. Next, we have substance use problems. Substance use is a well documented risk factor for sexual violence. Drugs and alcohol can lower inhibition, making individuals more likely to act on sexually uh, deviant behaviors and impulses. It can impair judgment, leading to poor decision making and increased risk taking behavior. And it can intensify aggression, particularly combined with other factors like psychopathy or sexual sadism, as we've talked about. Many sexual offenders report being intoxicated at the time of their offense, and substance use can exacerbate other risk factors such as impulsivity and poor emotion regulation. Addressing substance abuse through treatment programs is crucial in reducing reoffenses. Here we have suicidal and homicidal ideation. Suicidal ideation may arise in sex offenders due to guilt, shame, or hopelessness after their crimes are discovered or during incarceration. However, some cases, suicidal thoughts may also serve as a warning sign of impulsivity or emotional instability, increasing risk of further reckless or violent behavior. With regard to homicidal ideation, it is more common in individuals with psychopathy or sexual sadism, and it is often linked to violent sexual offenses. In some cases, offenders who experience paraphilic homicide fantasies may be driven to commit murder as part of their sexual deviance, making them extremely dangerous. Both suicidal and homicidal ideation are critical risk factors in sexual offense evaluations, particularly when combined with deviant sexual interests and aggressive tendencies. So, some other things that we need to think about are relationship problems. Sex offenders often experience relationship problems, which can manifest in several different ways. Perhaps that is an inability to maintain long term stable relationships, whether that is romantic, familial, or societal. They may have deficits with intimacy, where individuals struggle with forming close, healthy bonds and may seek out inappropriate or harmful relationships instead. Perhaps they have a history of abusive or controlling behavior in their various different types of relationships. And maybe they have sexual dysfunctions or unmet emotional needs, which may contribute to offending behavior. Relationship problems are particularly relevant to sexual offending because they may reflect the individual's dysfunctional coping strategies for dealing with emotional or interpersonal stress. So, a few examples here could be offenders cannot develop appropriate adult sexual and or emotional relationships and may turn to deviant sexual behaviors instead, such as child sexual abuse, voyeurism, or exhibitionism as a substitute. A history of abusive relationships can normalize violence or coercion, making the offender more likely to engage in sexual violence or exploitation. Offenders may resort to deviant behavior as a means to exert power and control, especially if they feel a lack of control in their personal lives. Many sex offenders, particularly those who target children or vulnerable adults, have a history of social isolation or difficulty relating to peers. This isolation can further entrench deviant sexual interests, as offenders may rely on fantasies or deviant outlets to cope with their relationship failures. Let's talk about employment problems, which can include unemployment, unstable job history, or poor work performance. These problems may not be directly related to sexual offending, but are associated with a general pattern of lifestyle instability that increases the risk of both sexual and non sexual recidivism. So, some specific employment related risk factors include frequent job changes, indicating a lack of consistency and commitment, job loss due to misconduct, including behavioral issues or violations of workplace rules, periods of long term unemployment, which can lead to social isolation, financial stress, and depression, inability to hold positions of trust or responsibility, reflecting broader issues with authority, rules, or personal accountability. Unemployment and unstable employment contributes to financial stress and psychosocial stress, which may push offenders into high risk behaviors. So, stress and frustration from employment problems can act as triggers for deviant sexual behavior, especially if the offender turns to deviant outlets as a way of coping with their stress. Employment problems may also reduce self esteem, further pushing offenders toward inappropriate outlets for emotional gratification. And some offenders may use their position at work to target victims, particularly if they have access to vulnerable individuals such as children, customers, subordinates, making supervision and monitoring of offenders in certain job roles critical. Let's talk about post non sexual violence. This refers to violent behavior after a sexual offense has been committed or as part of a broader pattern of offending. While non sexual violence may not involve a sexual component, it still signals a propensity for aggression, poor emotion regulation, and a disregard for the law. Non sexual violence may include assault, so physical assault without a sexual motivation, domestic violence, including controlling or coercive behavior in an intimate relationship, robbery or other violent crimes that involve force or threat, or even gang violence and organized crime activities. Offenders with a history of post non sexual violence are more likely to engage in future violent offenses, which may include sexual violence. This risk factor is particularly concerning for individuals with psychopathy or antisocial personality disorder who may engage in violent behavior, impulsivity, or just without remorse. Post non sexual violence suggests an escalation in dangerous behavior, especially if violence increases in severity over time. A pattern of general criminality where sex offenses are one part of a broader pattern of criminal activity, indicating a failure to reintegrate into society. A lack of control over aggressive impulses, which may make it more likely for the individual to engage in sexual assault, especially if combined with sexually deviant arousal. Non sexual violence also demonstrates that the offender poses a broad risk to public safety, not just in terms of sexual offending, but also in terms of their overall potential for harmful and violent behavior. So, post non-violent offending includes non-violent crimes committed after an individual has been convicted of a sexual offense. So, some examples of non-violent offending include theft, shoplifting, burglary, embezzlement, fraud, such as white collar crimes, drug offenses, including possession or distribution of illegal substances, and public order offenses such as loitering or trespassing. Post nonviolent offending may seem unrelated to sexual offenses, but it reflects, again, broader issues with impulse control, disregard for the law, and a failure to rehabilitate. These behaviors suggest that the offender has not adopted pro social behaviors and may still be engaging in risky and impulsive activity. Post nonviolent offending is a sign that the individual is unable to follow supervision, conditions, or other legal restrictions, that the offender continues to make poor decisions, putting them at risk for re-engaging in sexual offenses, especially if nonviolent crimes are opportunistic or driven by immediate needs. Substance use or addiction may be a driving force, especially if nonviolent crimes are drug related, further increasing the risk of sexual reoffending when under the influence of substances. Additionally, post nonviolent offending may be seen as a gateway to more serious offenses, including violent and or sexual crimes. The presence of nonviolent criminal behavior suggests the offender's overall risk of criminal behavior remains high, even if it is not directly tied to sexual offending. Let's talk about past supervision failures. This occurs when an individual violates conditions of parole, probation, other forms of community supervision, and these violations can include failure to attend mandatory treatment programs, for example, sex offender therapy, breaking curfew, or other restrictions on movement or activities, failure to register as a sex offender. We talked about this earlier. That is post release supervision, one of the many ways in which we supervise individuals after being committed of a sex crime. Contact with prohibited individuals, such as children or victims, or being in violation of court orders. and reoffending, whether through new sexual offenses or other types of criminal acts. Past supervision failures are a major predictor of future sexual recidivism because they indicate an inability or unwillingness to comply with legal and social boundaries. Offenders who fail under supervision are more likely to reoffend sexually or engage in other criminal behaviors because they do not respond well to external controls or interventions. They may show resistance to treatment or rehabilitation, particularly if they do not take supervision conditions seriously. They may have poor impulse control and a higher likelihood of engaging in risky behavior when not directly monitored. Supervision failures may also indicate that offenders may not be amenable to community based interventions, and more restrictive or long term supervision may be necessary to mitigate the risk of reoffending. So, we're going to talk about paraphilias. As you can see in this red box, these are some areas for diagnosing paraphilias, but I also just want to make sure that you understand what a paraphilia is. So, let's zoom out and talk broadly about what a paraphilia is. Paraphilias are intense, persistent sexual interests in activities, objects, or situations that deviate from societal norms and typically involve non consenting individuals, perhaps non human objects, or harm. Some paraphilias are classified as disorders, particularly when they lead to distress, impairment in functioning, or involve harmful non consensual behaviors. So, we're going to talk first about exhibitionism disorder. This involves deriving sexual arousal from exposing one's genitals to unsuspecting or non consenting individuals. A few key aspects of this particular paraphilia is the thrill or the shock associated with being observed. Some key characteristics involve arousal dependent upon that non consensual nature of the exposure, meaning the individual experiences heightened sexual excitement from the reaction of this unsuspecting victim. Another key characteristic is risk seeking behaviors, which often occur in public places such as parks or streets where the offender can encounter strangers. And offenders who have exhibitionism disorder experience compulsive urge to expose themselves and may repeat the behavior despite negative consequences. Next, we're going to talk about voyeuristic disorder, which involves achieving sexual arousal by secretly observing others, usually in private settings without their consent. So, for example, this may look like spying on people, undressing, bathing, or engaging in sexual activities. Some key characteristics around voyeurism include the arousal that comes from the act of watching, typically in situations where that person does not know that they are being observed. The individual may engage in repeated covert attempts to observe others, often escalating over time to more risky or intrusive behavior. And this particular disorder usually begins in adolescence and can persist throughout the lifetime. Frauderistic disorder involves sexual arousal from touching or rubbing one's genitals against a non consenting person, typically in crowded places like on public transportation, in clubs, or at concerts. Some key characteristics involve the act of covert, with the offender taking advantage of crowded or confined spaces to engage in the behavior without detection. The individual may fantasize about the victim's response or reaction, imagining them enjoying or being complicit in the act. This often begins in late adolescence or early adulthood and is found to be more common in males. Pedophilia. This is characterized by the persistent sexual attraction to prepubescent children, typically under the age of 13. It is one of the most serious and criminally charged paraphilias due to its involvement with vulnerable individuals. Some key characteristics here include fantasies, urges, or behaviors that target children, including sexual touching, manipulation, or penetration. Some individuals with pedophilic disorder may attempt to rationalize their behavior, claiming that they love or care for the child and that the child benefits from this attention. Pedophiles may also go to great lengths to groom children, gaining their trust before initiating contact, which may involve manipulation, coercion, or deceit. We are not going to talk about all the paraphilias that exist, but we are going to talk about just a few more. Sexual masochism. involve sexual arousal from being humiliated, beaten, bound, or otherwise made to suffer. The individual derives sexual gratification from receiving pain or being degraded. Some key characteristics involve the behavior ranging from mild, light spanking to more severe, extreme bondage, beating, or asphyxiation. Some individuals may put themselves in risky situations or relationships that are abusive to fulfill these masochistic desires. The behavior is considered a disorder when it causes significant distress or impairs functioning. So, while consensual masochism is very common in the BDSM community, when the behavior involves non consensual or dangerous acts, it results in serious physical or emotional harm. Some individuals may engage in self harm, increasing the risk of injury or death, especially in cases of extreme masochism like autoerotic asphyxiation. Lastly, we are going to touch upon sexual sadism. This is characterized by deriving sexual pleasure from causing physical and psychological suffering to another person. The sadist usually enjoys inflicting pain, humiliation, and control over the victim. Some key characteristics include consensual activities within the BDSM community, but in the context of the disorder, the acts are non consensual and go beyond safe boundaries. So that's going to be an important piece to remember. The sadist may engage in violent acts, including beatings, restraints, torture, or non consensual sexual acts. There is often a power dynamic where the offender seeks to dominate and control the victim completely. So, as you can see in this red box here, some areas to cover for diagnosing paraphilias include early sexual experience and interests, so getting a lot of information about early history, the number and context of sexual partners, getting information about their paraphilic behavior or behaviors, perhaps they are engaging in more than one, indicators of sexual self control difficulty. So, making sure that we ask about extensive porn use or use of sex workers, and history of illegal sexual activity. So, if they have any prior charges or convictions, we certainly want to know about that. As you can see in this gray box here, there is a tool that we can use called the Screening Scale for Pedophilic Interests, which is the SSPI, and this can help us to assess the likelihood of pedophilic interests in individuals, particularly in the context of forensic settings. And it provides the objective method for identifying characteristics commonly associated with pedophilia. The purpose is to identify pedophilic interests. It is a screener for pedophilic tendencies by evaluating specific behavioral and criminal patterns associated with pedophilia, and it aids in assessing the risk for future violence, specifically future sexual violence, particularly those involving children. Some components include the scoring based on observable behaviors and documented offenses. Some common elements evaluated include the victim's age. Offenses against younger children, especially prepubescent children, are more indicative of pedophilic interests. The number of victims, the higher number of child victims may suggest more entrenched patterns of pedophilic behavior. The sex of the victim, so pedophilic interest may be linked to a preference for male victims, although it can also include female victims. The use of physical contact, whether the offense involved physical contact, particularly that of a sexual nature. So the SSPI provides a numerical score based on the presence of these factors, with higher scores indicating a higher likelihood of pedophilic interest. A score is typically used in conjunction with other forensic and psychological assessments to guide treatment, risk management, and legal decision making. The SSPI is particularly useful in criminal justice settings, such as during the evaluation and assessment of sex offenders, parole evaluations, or for treatment planning. This is not a standalone diagnostic tool, but rather a screening instrument to identify potential cases requiring further, more in depth assessment. So let's move on to our next slide here. and talk about some other factors that may be related to sexual offenses, including high density of offenses. High density of sexual offenses refers to a pattern in which an individual commits multiple sexual offenses within a relatively short time frame. Some characteristics include frequent, repeated offending behavior over a concentrated period of time, suggesting a compulsive or entrenched drive to commit sexual offenses. Offenders with high density patterns may disregard the consequences for social norms, acting with a sense of urgency or compulsivity to satisfy deviant sexual urges. This pattern often indicates a lack of control over deviant sexual impulses and can correlate with the escalation and severity of offenses. A high density of offenses is a red flag for future offending because the individual has previously been caught, but they continue to offend. Escalation refers to a pattern in which the frequency, intensity, or violence of an offender's sexual crime increases over time. And escalation may manifest as shorter intervals between offenses, indicating a growing inability to suppress deviant urges or a declining fear of consequences. The severity of the crime may also increase, with offenders moving from non contact offenses, so exhibitionism or voyeurism, to more invasive, violent, or physically harmful behaviors such as rape, sexual assault, or sexual homicide. Escalation may also involve moving from solo offenses to group based or organization based crimes, where offenders work with others to commit offenses. Multiple types of sexual offenses is our next category here. And this is when a person engages in multiple types of sex offenses, demonstrating a broad pattern of sexual deviance where the offender's interests are not confined to a single type of victim or behavior. The offender may commit various forms of sexual crimes, such as child molestation, rape, exhibitionism, voyeurism. This variability suggests polymorphous deviance, where the individual is sexually aroused by different types of deviant behavior, making it hard to predict or control future offending. The offender's lack of specialization, if you will, can indicate an evolving sexual preference for various non consensual or harmful activities, heightening their risk. The offender who commits multiple types of sexual violence may adapt their behaviors over time, switching from one type of an offense to another, complicating risk assessments. And these individuals are often generalist offenders, meaning that they are not more likely to continue committing sexual offenses, even if their initial type of offending is addressed or treated. Next, we have physical harm to the victim. Sexual offenses that involve physical harm to a victim beyond the sexual abuse itself represents a significant escalation in both the severity of the crime and the risk that the offender poses. Physical harm can range from bruises, cuts, broken bones to more severe injuries such as strangulation, beatings, or other forms of assault. Inflicting physical harm often indicates sadistic tendencies or a desire for power and dominance over the victim, increasing the overall dangerousness of the offender. Offenders who physically harm their victims during sexual assaults often show complete disregard for the victim's well being, further elevating their risk profile. Let's talk about the use of weapons or threats. The use of weapons or threats to kill during a sexual offense significantly increases the severity of the crime and is a strong predictor of future violence and recidivism. Offenders may use knives, guns, or other weapons to intimidate or physically overpower the victim. Threats of death or threatening gestures, such as choking, placing a weapon to the victim's body, or verbal death threats, are used to control and terrorize the victim, ensuring compliance. The use of weapons or threats suggests a higher level of premeditation and willingness to escalate violence if necessary. Let's move on to lack of realistic plans. So, some characteristics include inadequate or impractical life goals. Individuals with risk factors often fail to develop achievable or structured plans for the future. They may not have plans related to stable housing, employment, or building pro social relationships. Instead, they may engage in fantasy based thinking or unrealistic expectations about their future, which can lead to impulsive, maladaptive decision making. Failure to address risk factors. Offenders without realistic plans often fail to address or mitigate risk factors that contribute to their offending behavior. For instance, they may not plan for how to manage triggers related to their offending, such as substance use, access to vulnerable individuals, or situations that arouse deviant sexual interests. The individual may have poor problem solving. This inability to form realistic, attainable goals is often related to deficiencies in problem solving and decision making skills, making it harder for these individuals to deal with challenges post incarceration or upon release. And the offender may have weak or even non existent social support systems and may struggle to reintegrate into society and face difficulties maintaining a law abiding lifestyle. They may lack close, supportive friends or family, making it harder to establish accountability. And how this relates to risk is that without a clear, actionable plan for post release life, offenders may find themselves in situations that increase the risk of reoffending, such as homelessness, unemployment, or just engaging in high risk social circles. The inability to create realistic goals leads to instability in their reintegration into the community. Individuals with no plans or overly vague ones may be more likely to fall into old habits and dysfunctional patterns that contribute to their offending behavior. Offenders without realistic plans can be challenging to supervise effectively as they often lack clear goals and direction, making compliance with probation, parole conditions, and monitoring requirements more difficult. If offenders don't plan for managing substance use or other triggers, they are at increased risk of relapse, which can also increase the likelihood of engaging in sexual violent behaviors. And let's also talk about negative attitudes towards treatment. Offenders who have a negative attitude towards treatment may be unwilling to engage in therapy. Maybe they are denying their need for help. Maybe they are actively resisting attempts to address their offending behavior. They may dismiss or minimize the significance of their offense, claiming that they don't need treatment or that the system is unfair. And this is connecting back to the other bullet points up here of minimization and denial, and as well as attitudes that support and condone these offenses. So again, a common sign of negative attitude toward treatment is the outright denial of offending behavior. Offenders may refuse to take responsibility, claiming that they didn't commit the offense or that the victim consented, even in cases where the evidence is overwhelming. Offenders may also, again, minimize the harm they have caused or justify their behavior by blaming external factors such as the victim's behavior, substance abuse, or mental health issues. They may view their behavior as less serious or even excusable. These offenders often exhibit low motivation to engage in treatment, showing a lack of interest in learning new skills or strategies to manage deviant sexual arousal, to address past trauma, or to alter dysfunctional thinking patterns. Their participation in treatment is often superficial, with little genuine effort to understand their behavior or work towards meaningful change. Some offenders harbor hostility or mistrust towards treatment providers, probation officers, or the justice system as a whole. They may view treatment as punitive rather than rehabilitative, fostering resentment and decreasing their willingness to engage in therapeutic work. So let's talk about how this relates to risk. Negative attitudes towards treatment are a major predictor of reoffending. Offenders who resist or reject treatment are less likely to develop the necessary coping mechanisms to manage their risk factors. This lack of insight and refusal to change increases the chance of them returning to their offending behavior. Offenders with negative attitudes towards treatment often resist taking accountability for their actions. This lack of responsibility and insight can hinder their ability to learn from their mistakes, to make better decisions in the future, and to avoid high risk situations. Negative attitudes towards treatment are often linked to poor compliance with supervision and parole conditions. Offenders may intentionally violate restrictions, for example, avoiding certain places or people, or attending mandatory therapy sessions, increasing the risk of reoffense. If an individual does not believe or value treatment, they are unlikely to engage in self reflection and behavioral changes that require successful rehabilitation. This is particularly concerning in cases of sexual deviance, where offenders need specialized treatment to address deeply ingrained patterns of behavior. Without treatment and insight into their offending behavior, there is a risk that offenders may escalate in terms of the severity of their offenses or the harm they inflict on future victims. Unaddressed deviant sexual interests or other risk factors like substance abuse, poor emotion regulation, or anger management issues can intensify over time. So, we have talked about a lot of risk factors, and these on this slide are the most researched risk factors, especially when it comes to sexual violence. So, again, we've talked about this. The best predictor of future behavior is past behavior, and that is our first bullet point here is prior sexual offenses. Again, we want to get a very detailed history about deviant sexual interests. We've talked at length about this here today. Psychopathy, we've had an entire lecture on psychopathy and the PCL, but also too just general antisocial lifestyle. So let's talk about unrelated victims. An offender who targets victims outside of their family or known social circle are often seen as displaying a higher level of predatory behavior. This can indicate a more calculated and opportunistic approach to offending, suggesting a greater level of risk. Unrelated male victims are often chosen based on perceived vulnerability. Offenders may seek out victims who appear less likely to resist, to report the crime, such as younger boys or those who may be socially isolated. Offenders who target unrelated victims may exhibit more antisocial personality traits or predatory instincts, which can correlate with higher rates of recidivism. The choice of unrelated male victims can suggest a greater risk of escalation in offending behaviors, moving from non contact offenses such as voyeurism to more severe contact offenses such as sexual assault. Offenders who choose unrelated male victims may show signs of emotional detachment, indicating psychopathy or a lack of empathy. This emotional disconnection can result in a higher level of risk of severe violence during offenses. So let's talk about the age of the offender. Offenders in their late teens or early 20s may still be undergoing emotional and psychological development. Their offenses may be driven by impulsivity or experimentation rather than deeply ingrained deviant patterns. However, some young offenders may also exhibit high risk behaviors or antisocial tendencies that can lead to serious risk. Then, when we get to middle aged offenders, offenders in their 30s and 40s may have established patterns of behavior, and their offenses may be more indicative of longstanding issues related to deviance, such as untreated paraphilic disorders or enduring antisocial personality traits. And then we get to older offenders at 50 years and older may have a varied risk profile. Some may show a decrease in sexual offending due to aging, while others may exhibit a reduction in impulse control and an increased likelihood of reoffending, especially if they have not received appropriate treatment or intervention. So, whenever it comes to age, the research generally from 18 to 30 is the highest risk, whereas as we get into older age, it's more low risk, as you can see on this slide, 60 plus. So, research indicates that age is a significant predictor in recidivism rates. Younger offenders often have higher recidivism rates, particularly if their offenses were impulsive rather than premeditated. In contrast, older offenders may show reduced recidivism, but can still pose a risk if their deviant interests are entrenched. The age of the offender can influence their maturity, insight, and willingness to engage in treatment. Younger offenders may be less likely to recognize the consequences of their actions and may struggle with taking responsibility, while older offenders may have more significant barriers to treatment if they have entrenched patterns of denial or minimization. Age-related factors such as cognitive development and life experience can also affect the individual's ability to understand the implications of their actions and engage in rehabilitative efforts. Younger offenders may have less life experience, leading to a failure to grasp the long-term consequences of their behavior. Let's circle back to sexually violent predators before we wrap up our lecture for today. Again, SVP evaluations are critical assessments conducted to determine whether an individual meets specific legal criteria for civil commitment as a sexually violent predator. These evaluations focus on three main components, which are the mental abnormality, the volitional impairment, and elevated risk of reoffending. So, again, we discussed this earlier. Mental abnormality in the context of SVP evaluations is referring to a psychological condition or a disorder that significantly impairs the individual's ability to control their sexual behavior. This term often encompasses a range of paraphilic disorders and other psychological issues that can contribute to sexual violent behavior. We talked about these already, various different paraphilic disorders, personality disorders, and potentially even psychotic disorders, where the psychosis can distort perceptions of reality. For instance, delusions and hallucinations that may exacerbate risky sexual behavior. So, as we're thinking about the mental abnormality prong, we need to assess this through clinical interviews, psychological testing, collateral information such as family members, treatment providers, previous evaluations. We may use some tools such as the MMPI, the multiphasic personality inventory, or the static 99, which is a risk tool. We also want to examine the individual's history of sexual offenses. We talked at length about this already today, so just really getting a very good history. If they have had any type of treatment, understanding what their response was to treatment, and just getting a very comprehensive understanding of this person's psychological profile is going to be very necessary. As we move on to the volitional prong, this component refers to the individual's diminished capacity to control their sexual behavior or conform their conduct to societal norms. It assesses whether the person has the ability to refrain from sexually violent behavior, even if they have the desire to or the urge to act. Individuals may exhibit a pattern of behavior indicating a lack of control over their impulses, suggesting they cannot manage their sexual urges. This can manifest as repeated offenses despite attempts at treatment or monitoring. The offender may lack insight into their behavior and the consequences, further hindering their ability to control their actions, and they may deny responsibility or justify their behavior, leading to continued risk. Certain mental disorders can contribute to volitional impairment as they can affect impulse control, decision making, and emotion regulation. We talked about these earlier. Potentially being in a manic phase of a bipolar disorder, using substances. This may impair the individual's ability to refrain from acting on sexual urges. Again, we can use risk tools such as the static 99 or the HCR20, often used by forensic psychologists and other experts to help determine the likelihood that an individual will reoffend. We also want to look at patterns of behavior, including prior offenses, again, responses to treatment, history of other types of impulsive behavior, violations of supervision conditions, relapses into problematic behavior, suggesting some type of volitional impairment. We are also going to have the opportunity to interview the offender, and so we want to know about their self-reported experiences, motivations, justifications for their actions. This can help the evaluator gauge the individual's insight into their volitional control. And this last prong here is the elevated risk. This aspect involves evaluating the likelihood that an individual will reoffend in the future. Factors contributing to elevated risk include the individual's history of offenses, psychological characteristics, and environmental influences. Earlier, we had talked about static and dynamic risk factors. Evaluators assess both static factors, such as prior offenses or age of the first offense. Remember, static factors don't change. And then dynamic factors, which do change. So that could look like current mental state, treatment compliance, and these both are going to influence the likelihood of future offending. Research has shown that certain behavior patterns, characteristics, are statistically linked to higher recidivism rates among sex offenders. Individuals who exhibit antisocial behaviors, substance abuse issues, and a history of violent offenses tend to be at greater risk. Evaluators need to consider the individual's living situation, their social support, and their potential access to vulnerable populations. Environments that lack supervision or positive support can contribute to elevated risk. Again, some other assessment tools that we can use. Again, we mentioned the static 99, but dynamic appraisal of situation aggression, the DASA, are used to evaluate the individual's risk level based on historical and current factors. And these instruments can help quantify risk and assist in developing management strategies. So here in this gray box, we need to talk a little bit about Rogers and Shulman, 2005. They conducted some significant research in the field of forensic psychology, particularly in relationship to the assessment of sexually violent predators. And their work highlighted several critical factors that contribute to understanding volitional impairments in offenders, and specifically how these factors influence an individual's likeliness to reoffend. So, a few of these would be the lack of capacity for meaningful choice. This refers to an individual's ability to make informed and reasoned decisions regarding their behavior. For those who lack this capacity, decisions may be driven by impulsive urges rather than rational thought processes. Offenders who lack the capacity for meaningful choice may struggle to consider the consequences of their actions fully. This is particularly relevant in sexually violent offenders who may act on urges without weighing the potential impact on themselves or others. Evaluators may assess cognitive functioning, insight, and awareness of the consequences of their actions when determining if the offender has the capacity for meaningful choice, and this assessment can inform treatment strategies aimed at enhancing decision making abilities. Next, we have disregard for personal consequences. This factor indicates an individual's tendency to act without regard for how their behavior affects themselves or others. This reflects a lack of empathy or consideration of the repercussions of their harmful actions. This disregard is often seen in individuals with psychopathic traits, where offenders may not feel guilt or remorse for their actions, leading to an increased likelihood of reoffending. Assessing this characteristic can be crucial in predicting recidivism. Those who demonstrate a significant disregard for personal consequences may require targeted interventions to address their cognitive distortions and, if possible, enhance empathy. Incapacity for delay. This refers to the inability to postpone immediate gratification in favor of long term goals or benefits. Offenders who struggle with this capacity often act impulsively, prioritizing immediate urges over potential negative outcomes. Such incapacity may manifest in the inability to resist sexual urges, leading to impulsive and potentially violent sexual acts. Evaluators must look for patterns of impulsivity in behavior, considering the offender's history of actions that suggest a lack of inability to delay gratification. Treatment programs may focus on developing skills to manage impulse and delay gratification. And lastly, we have chronicity. This refers to the persistent and long term nature of problematic behaviors or conditions in the context of sexual offending. Chronicity implies that an individual has a history of repeated offenses over time. Individuals with chronic offending patterns are often seen as having entrenched behavioral patterns, making it more difficult to alter their behavior or thought processes. Understanding the chronicity of an offender's behavior is especially important for assessing risk. Chronic offenders may need more intensive treatment and supervision due to their entrenched behaviors. Evaluators often consider the length and frequency of the offending history when determining treatment needs and risk levels. So, when assessing the risk of sexual offending, forensic psychologists need to utilize various different methods, broadly categorized into actuarial and structured professional judgment approaches. Each method has its own strengths and limitations, and when they can be applied in different contexts depending upon the assessment goals and characteristics of the individual being evaluated. So, first, we're going to talk about actuarial. These involve statistical techniques to predict the likelihood of reoffending based on empirical data. These tools typically rely on established risk factors identified through research and analysis of offender populations. Actuarial tools are objective and they provide quantifiable risk estimates based on standardized data. They are more reliable due to their foundation in research and statistical analysis. And these tools typically focus on specific variables that have been shown to correlate with recidivism. A few examples here are the static 99 or the static 99 revised. This is a widely used actuarial tool that assesses the risk of sexual recidivism based on static factors such as historical and unchangeable factors like age at the first offense, prior offenses, etc. And it provides a score that categorizes offenders into different levels, such as low, moderate, or high risk. We also have the VRAG, which stands for Violence Risk Appraisal Guide. While primarily focused on violent recidivism, the VRAG can be applied to certain sexual offenders. It's used in combination with static risk factors to predict the likelihood of future violent acts, and it produces a risk score that helps in determining the management of treatment options, which then leads us to the SORAG, which is the Sex Offender Risk Appraisal Guide. Again, similar to the VRAG, the SORAG is specifically designed for sex offenders and includes static variables that have predictive validity regarding sexual recidivism, and it offers an estimate of risk based on historical data about the offender. Now let's talk a little bit about structured professional judgment methods. These methods integrate both actuarial data as well as professional clinical judgment. These assessments use structured frameworks that guide evaluators in considering relevant risk factors while allowing for individualized interpretation based on the offender's unique circumstances. So, these types of methods accommodate new information and contextual factors, allowing the clinician to adapt their assessment based on individual case by case basis. These approaches also leverage the expertise of the clinician to incorporate dynamic factors. Remember, those are changeable over time and unique aspects of the offender's history and situation. And the structured professional judgments also tend to provide a more holistic assessment of risk, considering both empirical data and clinical insights. So, a couple examples here could be the HCR 20. This stands for Historical Clinical Risk Management. While originally developed for assessing general violence risk, the HCR 20 is applicable to sexual offenders. It evaluates historical, clinical, and risk management factors. Clinicians rate specific items in each category to determine risk levels and that can inform treatment and management decisions. We've got the stable and the acute 2009. These tools focus on dynamic risk factors and acute risk factors relevant to sexual offending, and they provide a structured framework for assessing ongoing risk. This can help clinicians evaluate areas for intervention and potential changes over time. We've also got the SAVERY, that stands for Structured Assessment of Violence Risk in Youth. Although designed for assessing youth, the SAVERY includes elements relevant for understanding risk in young offenders, young sexual offenders, and it incorporates both static and dynamic risk factors. It can aid in developing interventions tailored to the individual youth's circumstances. As you can see here, we've got a table at the bottom, just giving you a little breakdown and a reminder of the difference between actuarial and structured professional judgment methods. So that'll be helpful for you just to remember the difference between the two. And that's all that we have for today. Thank you for your time and attention, and I hope that you learned a lot today.